Stereotypes are a way of grouping people, cultures, races, and beliefs together. Often, stereotypes are oversimplified and narrow-minded views that have negative effects on the group of people they are stereotyping. Stereotypes can be combated in many ways, mostly through more diversity in the media we consume or even produce. Most important of all is representation, which can be achieved through more diversity, because successful representation shows the world as it is, while also showing the world as audience of movies and other texts want it to be. One group often portrayed in Hollywood in this narrow view is Asians. Asian Americans are one of the largest group of people in the United States, with a population of 2.26 million according to census. In fact, Asia itself has the largest population of all other continents. But often in movies and TV, such a large group is depicted in one of two categories. These categories are known as the yellow peril and the model minority. Both stem from a long history of violence against Asian people in U.S. history and attempts to hide institutional racism in American society. The term yellow peril has a longer history than model minority, believed to be named by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany in the late 19th century and can date all the way back to Genghis Khan and his invasion of Europe. Model minority, on the other hand, was coined in the 1960s by two magazines praising Chinese and Japanese Americans to be a model minority who focused heavily on education, close family values, and being seen as law-abiding citizens, stated by Yuko Kawai in 2003. To take a better look at both stereotypes, the historical context behind both must be explored, and examples of two stereotypes as shown in recent media must be looked at. It is important to understand how these two stereotypes are connected and the effect they have on Asian communities today, and to know why these stereotypes are still around today. Racial stereotypes, according to Bradley W. Gorham, influence our interpretations in a way that reinforces popular racial myths. Looking at the idea of a model minority, we can find several examples in media texts, especially in movies. The model minority is oftentimes portrayed as a quiet, smart, and well-rounded individual. While not necessarily a negative portrayal, it does have negative implications. According to Kawai, the stereotype is designed to be a colorblind approach that disproves the idea of institutional racism. It can be seen in several media texts. For example, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, which introduces moviegoers to the character known as Cho Chang. According to the creator of the series, J.K. Rowling, the character is meant to be Chinese. However, both Cho and Chang are Korean surnames. That's not the only reason the character can be seen as problematic, though. Cho Chang represents the idea of a model minority very easily. For starters, she's part of a group in the series that is seen as smarter than the others. She is shy and quiet, and a star sports player. This is not a negative portrayal, though. The problem with Cho Chang is that the only thing distinctly Asian about her is her name, which does not match her given ethnicity. The model minority can be negative for a variety of reasons, but the most prominent is because it holds groups of people to unfair standards, and is seldom an accurate portrayal of a character's cultural background. Kawai points out that the model minority is also harmful because it started as a trend in books and movies to disprove institutional racism in the States, and started as an attempt to paint Asian characters as one of the good ones. So while the idea itself is not negative, the historical implications behind the term can be equally as harmful as that of the yellow peril stereotype. The idea of a yellow peril began a very long time ago, but its perpetuation in American media can be traced to Pearl Harbor, World War II, and Japanese internment camps. According to Brooks and Herbert, the representation of Asian men in media is restricted mostly to movies, and for a while these depictions were either a foreign threat or martial artists, among other things. The threatening figure that's seen, such as Fu Manchu, can still occasionally be seen in the media today, though it's less common than the model minority. For example, in 2013's Iron Man 3, there was originally supposed to be a character called the Mandarin. From the name alone, it's obvious that this character is a classic example of the yellow peril. To escape the criticism, the character was teased, and in a twist ending was replaced with a completely different villain from Marvel Comics. The yellow peril is a dangerous stereotype, and luckily it's far less common now than it was before. Still, the stereotype has had long-term negative impacts on Asian communities and how they're seen today, and still today subtly hidden in different media texts. For example, in the 2020 game Cyberpunk 2077, one of the main villains is another common trope in films for Asians, that being a corrupt businessman. Racial tensions against Asians and Asian Americans have traces back to this idea of the yellow peril and was clearly seen in the LA riots in the 1990s. Cook, Jackson, and Hansen say that producers must look carefully at the responsibilities they have to properly portray a group or individual from a culture. There is an ethical dilemma when it comes to stereotypes because they are hard to avoid as they have been ingrained in our media for so long. A studio can create a character that plays into a stereotype, but depending on the connotation, this move can be detrimental. This is why we see these good and bad stereotypes today. Mariana Kidd believes stereotypes were a neutral way for people to classify different cultures and groups, but now the concept of stereotype is limited to often one-sided portrayals of limited characteristics that are often incorrect. Kawai says that these two variations of stereotypes cannot be separated. Because of the history behind them, they are ultimately connected. You can't have one without the other. So where can accurate and non-stereotypical portrayals of Asians in media be found? Many are quick to point directly to Asian media, be it Japanese animation or even the movie Crazy Rich Asians. Although it is a Hollywood production, Crazy Rich Asians was praised extensively for having primarily Asian American cast. While this representation is a step forward, it does not avoid stereotypes, particularly the idea of rich Asians, which again were seen as a threat linking back to the yellow peril, just in a different vein as previously described. This leads to the question, is it possible to have a character that isn't a stereotype in some way? Brooke Jackson and Hansen say, no. Stereotyping is inevitable, and point out that groups may internalize these stereotypes, negative or positive, and this internalization devalues what makes their culture unique. The main problem with stereotyping comes from over-stereotyping and constant stereotypes that are false, misleading, and pushed so fervently by producers and media. Crazy Rich Asians is seen as a step forward for one major reason: representation that is inherently positive. Stereotypes are seen as bad because they are often a misrepresentation of a culture and paint the culture in a negative light. Through more diversity in studios, writers' rooms, and casting, this negative light nearly vanishes. The push for diversity and representation in Hollywood has been a long one, and now that it is becoming more common, it is important to address the negative implications a lack of representation and the prominence of stereotypes has had on cultures. Asian stereotypes in the media today can be viewed as positive, and stereotyping as a whole is nearly impossible to avoid as it has become a prominent part of media text. However, these positive stereotypes have roots in negativity from a long history of generalization and whitewashing, an attempt to dismiss the notion of institutionalized racism. To add on to this, we can still see negative portrayals and stereotypes for Asian characters in the media today, like the near ancient idea of yellow peril. To combat this, diverse representation within the media industries and in media text can set positive examples and role models without having to play too much into these stereotypes that have affected communities for a long period of time. Looking at movies like Fu Manchu or The Karate Kid and comparing them to recent movies such as Crazy Rich Asians, one can see that Asian representation in the media has come a long way in just the last few decades. And to be faithful, true, and accurate to Asian cultures and communities, this representation must continue.